Hello, everyone. Welcome to session 3K at the Texas Conference on Digital Libraries. My name is Taylor Davis Vanetta. I use the pronouns he, him, and I am the director of the Digital Research Commons at University of Houston's MD Anderson Library and a member of the TCDL Planning Committee. I'm pleased to be this session's moderator. Texas Digital Library and the TCDL Planning Committee are dedicated to providing an experience for everyone that is free from all forms of harassment and inclusive of all people. We ask that everyone here today be considerate and respectful in speech and action, attempt collaboration before conflict, refrain from demeaning, discriminatory, or harassing behavior and speech, and be mindful of your environment and your fellow participants. You can also view our full code of conduct on the homepage of the conference. This session will run until approximately 3:50 p.m. Central Time. There are no scheduled breaks, so please step away as you feel the need to. I invite you all to say hello in the chat and make comments throughout today's talks. You are also encouraged to post your questions in the Q&A section, where you can also vote on other questions that you'd like our speakers to answer. I'll be watching for questions in the Q&A and we'll share them with our speakers during the Q&A sections, either at the end of each of the two talks in the session or at the very end. We'll see how it goes. With that, I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker, Ian Barba. I will hand things over to Ian now to get us started. Ian.
Thank you. So hopefully you're all seeing that. See, no, it's great. So thank you for that introduction, Taylor. As you said, my name is Ian Barba, and I am a subject librarian at Texas Tech University Libraries. Today, I'll be presenting Subject Librarians, Outreach, and Digital Publishing. In May of 2020, I was approached by Dr. Victoria Serliuga, one of my faculty from the Classical and Modern Languages and Literatures Department at TTU. She was interested in publishing some of her existing scholarship as a new ebook that she was hoping to make available in Italian and English languages. The ebook would be published jointly through the TTU libraries, as well as Ytali, an Italian publisher based in Venice. She was unfamiliar with ebook publishing, and she hoped the library could provide some publishing expertise. There we go. So I had no such expertise at the time, but I was confident the library would be able to help. So a little bit about me. That's more or less what I look like over there on the right. A little bit older, a little bit more gray in my beard, but pretty close to that. I'm a subject liaison librarian serving the English departments and the CMLL departments at TTU since about October of 2013. Most of my interactions with students and faculty center around library instruction and helping patrons make sense of library resources and services. As a tenure-track faculty, I have experience editing my own research as well as informally serving as an editor for some of my colleagues. Prior to joining the library field, I also served as the thesis and dissertation coordinator for the TTU Graduate School. In that position, I worked with students toward the end of their thesis and dissertation process, and I became quite familiar with editing documents in both MS Word and Adobe Acrobat. So you might be asking, why is he talking about subject librarians at TCDL? Good question. Subject librarians provide highly visible and appreciated library services that are typically at the center of academic library outreach. For better or worse, these librarians are often seen as the face of the library for their faculty and students. I had worked with Dr. Serliuga several times before this project, either through class instruction sessions, through book or ebook purchase requests, or on library consultations in support of her own research. This existing relationship was the foundation for collaborating on this ebook. Dr. Serliuga, at the very least, trusted me enough to put her in touch with the person who could help her out best. Without that relationship, though, I'm certain she wouldn't have approached the library at all. So even though I didn't have any experience with a project like this, I knew of our library's scholarly communication efforts, including our Rater publishing program and the Pressbooks tool. I also knew that I needed help from Heidi Winkler, the digital services librarian here at TTU Libraries, as I had never used or even seen someone use Pressbooks before. At this point, my contributions to the ebook were limited to guidance on citation formatting and a little bit of work with the cover that you see there. I wasn't yet sure what else I might bring to the project, but I was happy to help out in whatever capacity I could. That said, between the three of us, we met and communicated by a combination of Zoom, by phone, and email, and hammered out the expectations for the project, the overall scope, and the timeline that we were working with. After consulting with Heidi on open access licenses and copyright implications for future researchers, Dr. Serliuga chose the attribution, non-commercial, and no derivatives license through Creative Commons for her ebook. We clarified with Ytali that this license was acceptable for the joint publication. We also determined that even though Pressbooks is intended more as a textbook or OER creation tool, it would serve the needs of the compilation style ebook that we were planning. From there, Dr. Serliuga gathered her materials as MS Word documents with embedded images and sent those along to Heidi Winkler, who began the process of moving those into Pressbooks. At first, this went relatively well. Pressbooks provides easy to understand templates and allows for content to be uploaded and organized in whatever size chunks that authors deem necessary. The bilingual ebook we're working on, Omaggio a Ezio Gribaudo, Homage to Ezio Gribaudo, has 26 dual language chapters with additional front and back matter sections. The work brings together Victoria's writings in Italian and English on the Italian artist Ezio Gribaudo that she originally published from 2014 to 2020. In addition to the text, every image in the book would be shown twice as well. If you look, you can see some of that organization in the image here. Though the ebook looked good and navigated really well within Pressbooks, the publishable PDF document did not meet Ytali's publication standards, and that's where much of my work began. So we had multiple issues to fix, some of those with the sizing of the images, some of those with the margins within the PDF, and some with some unusual spacing and kerning quirks with the Italian characters in the text. Moreover, in several instances, fixing one problem could often result in new issues that would cascade throughout the document. It thus became necessary to tackle edits in both a strategic and section by section approach. These edits took several weeks from start to finish. The largest issue, at least in terms of how disruptive it was for the overall look of the PDF ebook, related to image sizing and orphan control. Serliuga and Ytali strongly objected to large blank spaces that would appear in instances where an image would be too large to be placed immediately following a line of text and would instead be placed on a new page. In a medium like Pressbooks, these didn't exist as there were no pages to worry about at all. However, when converting to PDF, these blank spaces could range from half a page to 3/4 of a page in size. To deal with this issue, I went through the ebook section by section, resizing the images larger or smaller as needed. This solved the issue of blank space, but also created a new issue where images might appear on the page before or after where they had been originally, which also meant the table of contents had to be edited. We also had to navigate related spacing issues that arose when differences between Italian and English texts resulted in sentences and paragraphs to be slightly longer or shorter between sections. Most of the time, these were easy fixes, and it just meant moving images one line earlier or later within their sections. Occasionally, though, we either made slight edits to the text or would slightly fudge paragraph spacing and page margins to squeeze in the necessary extra line of text. So if you look closely in this image here, you might be able to see some of that fudging. Sometimes I would adjust the spacing between lines by literally 1 or 2 pixels, and that was enough that I could fit an extra line of text at the bottom. It's almost imperceptible unless you know to be looking for it. This is also a good example of the kerning issues I was talking about. So a quick definition of kerning, that's a term that just means the amount of space between letters in a particular font. Most fonts are not monospaced. They'll have different size characters for different letters. As I alluded to earlier, the kerning issues were the most mysterious problems we faced, as we never determined the culprit of them. However, during the editing process, we noticed that some changes would magically introduce unusual spaces or lack of spaces, or just simply delete the letters entirely, mainly in the Italian text of the document. Fixing these was a painstaking process, as they had to be corrected one at a time to make sure they were not creating new issues. Moreover, because I am not fluent in Italian, they were more difficult for me to spot than if they were in English. Thankfully, between the two of us, Dr. Suliuga and I found every offending instance, and together we were able to finally fix these annoying issues. All told, after 11 drafts, we finally had a document that would meet Ytali standards. Though I had not intended to initially, I became thoroughly familiar with Pressbooks because of these PDF edits. As a confirmed novice, I can say the tool is novice friendly, as I could make my edits section by section and quickly produce PDFs for quality assurance. Further, the versioning inherent in Pressbooks also helped immensely when edits would create greater problems than they solved. So here's an example of that versioning. This one particular section had 17 different versions saved within Pressbooks. I can choose to compare any version to another and revert to an earlier version if I needed to. A few times during this process, I was very thankful for this feature. At times, I would need to break apart sections from multiple versions into subsections or even pages, and then stitch those PDFs back together. So this is not meant to be a session about how to use Pressbooks. For anyone interested in that, I recommend you watch the recording from Amy Song's TCDL workshop from earlier this week, How to Remix in Pressbooks. Really though, what I just want to make clear is that Pressbooks is highly intuitive, even for a novice like me. And I think that speaks to a larger point about academic library scholarly communication and OER efforts. Of course, developing and hiring for specific skill sets will be increasingly important for academic libraries, but there is something to be said for just being present and being willing to learn. For any subject librarian colleagues watching this, you absolutely can engage in this kind of scholarship as part of your faculty and even student outreach. For scholarly communication librarians or those with related titles and duties, subject librarians are going to be your natural allies. This type of outreach is precisely what former ACRL President Cheryl Middleton has advocated for as a natural intersection between scholarly communication and liaison work. Of course, not every library nor subject librarian is the same. As Middleton points out, scholarly communication efforts are often shaped by faculty perceptions of the library that are not entirely within our control. It's up to us to reach out where we can, however. In discussing how library publishing services support scholarly communication, Park and Shim point to the importance of writing services, technology support, and copyright consultation. These types of services are all well within the capacity of even a typical subject librarian like me. After our project, I can also add Pressbooks experience to my repertoire. The point I really want to get across, though, is that if I can do this kind of scholarly communication, then almost any librarian can. And as librarians, this work is critical to our core values. Though faculty awareness of open access and predatory publishers is growing, The demands of promotion and tenure can often work to disincentivize faculty from knowing and exercising their rights as authors of valuable research. Librarians have a crucial role to play in pushing for greater open access adoption as a natural part of scholarly communication. And on a long enough timeline, I think this kind of advocacy is worth the effort. We finished our ebook project in September of 2020, and Almaggio was indeed published jointly by Ytali and ThinkTech, the TTU Libraries Institutional Repository. Researchers and artists can find the open access ebook by either English or Italian full text search. I also want to add how well received the ebook was within the Italian art and academic community. After publishing, the TTU Libraries and CMLL department hosted a virtual book discussion with Dr. Serliuga and the artist, Mr. Ezio Gribaudo. For my part, I gave a brief discussion of my editorial role on the project. Of course, this also served a double purpose of advertising my services as a librarian and the library as a potential scholarly communication partner to all the TTU faculty who attended. Moreover, our university president, Dr. Skovanek, was kind enough to introduce the Zoom session. And even though I am already through the tenure process, it still doesn't hurt to be seen doing a good job in front of the boss. So hopefully I've convinced at least some of you who have been hesitant about scholarly communication or about working with subject librarians on such projects that this is something you can and should try. But before my time is finished, I want to try sharing some lessons I learned through this experience. So first lesson, professional relationships build over time. Subject librarians have the benefit of being there first and most often. Demonstrating competence and regular liaison activities like class instruction and research support will work to build faculty's trust and expectations of the library. 2, work with people that you like. I was fortunate to work with Heidi Winkler, a colleague and a good friend. And even though Dr. Serliuga can be demanding, she's very passionate about teaching and research. And I've had many successful instruction sessions for her classes. Had this request come from an unfamiliar or difficult faculty member, or had someone else been in Heidi's position, my involvement with this project might have ended with a simple referral. 3rd, break down bigger problems into manageable chunks. This was the largest editing project I had worked on since my position at the graduate school, working with students on making sure their theses and dissertations were properly formatted. Pressbooks made breaking this project down into manageable components easy, and it was extremely helpful for my schedule and sanity. 4, establish expectations for communication. This is something I wish I had done at the start of the project, and that is setting sustainable communication expectations. So Dr. Serliuga would email and call, and I'm completely serious here, daily to multiple times daily as we worked on moving from Pressbooks to PDF. As a millennial, I completely fit the stereotype of someone who loathes long telephone conversations and is always astonished when people other than my parents use their phone as a phone. If I were to do this project again, I would try to limit phone or Zoom meetings to weekly and then use email for all other communication. And 5, self-care is important. So this project started and finished from May to September of 2020 while I was working from home and COVID-19 was a serious threat. Though we're closer to getting back to normal now, many librarians and academic faculty are still conducting business through Zoom. Not everyone who wants a vaccine can get one, and though infection numbers are down, COVID times are still not over. If you're pursuing a similar scholarly communication project anytime soon, give yourself enough time and space to legitimately try to get back to normal. And even outside of COVID times, librarians often take on too much work and struggle to say no to any of our patrons. And so I advocate be strong enough to value your time and give it only when it's earned. So that's my presentation. I want to thank everyone for attending and direct you to some additional reading if you're still interested in these kinds of scholarly communication projects. Also, at this time, if we want to open things up for questions, we can do that. I'm going to, there's my contact information there. Let me look at the chat. I haven't seen any.
Yeah, we do have one question in chat from Jeffrey Potter, who asked, how did you interweave the two languages, and how did this affect the information architecture of the book?
So they were not interweaved at all. The way it worked is sections were presented first in Italian because that was her primary audience, and then it would be duplicated in English immediately after. So chapter 1, Italian, chapter 1B, English, and so on from there. And all the parts of the book were like this. That's a good question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I just want to say congratulations on this project, Ian. It's really terrific work, and you were incredibly resourceful in putting it together. You mentioned P&T being a limiting factor for most research faculty, at least. I'm curious, like, can you imagine how you might position sort of these services to accommodate those demands moving forward?
That's such a tricky question. So I'm fortunate that my liaison duties are more on the humanities side. I think there's a greater adoption of open access publication in general there than some of the hard sciences. But really, I would try to push that personal connection, personal relationships. That's why I really, if you're a subject librarian, talk to any of the scholarly communication, OER, digital publishing, whatever you call it at your institution. Talk to those people about how to work together. And then for the other side, talk to your subject librarians. They're going to have the most personal connection to the faculty at your institutions, and they're going to know the people who are going to be, you know, the softest targets for these kinds of projects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any other questions for Ian? I love seeing projects that help broaden the imagination of our colleagues and communities across campus, and, you know, sort of illuminate what's possible, right? And this is definitely
absolutely
one. All right. If anyone else thinks of a question for Ian before the end of the session, feel free to pop it in the Q&A. For now, I will kick things over to Michaela and her team. Take it away.
Yes, thank you so much. Sorry, I'm just getting my things set up a little bit. Okay, cool. I see some thumbs up from Taylor. So hello all. Thank you so much for joining us today for our presentation, What's in a Name? Usability of Digital Exhibits, Collections, Sites, and Other Stuff. My name is Michaela Narlock, and I am joined today by my colleagues, Anna Michelle Martinez-Montavon and Melissa Harden. We have an action-packed program for you today, so we're just going to jump right into discussing our digital library presence at the University of Notre Dame Hesburgh Libraries. After a little bit of institutional context, we will describe our most recent research effort, a series of surveys designed to better understand how we describe and name our library's digital collections, exhibits, and projects in a concise yet descriptive manner. We will describe our initial findings and anticipated next steps for this work, and of course, there'll be some time at the end for Q&A. So like many institutions, the digital collection and library presence at Hesburgh Libraries developed in an ad hoc fashion. Curators and specialists created and shared digital collections, exhibits, and projects using the most recently available technologies. This ranged from custom boutique HTML sites, as is shown in the top left, through our institutional repository in the bottom left, and all the way up to our homegrown software created to support the curation of digital exhibits in the top right. These tools were available inconsistently for internal users. Ambiguity around roles, responsibilities, and guidelines meant that some individuals would just use whatever technology was more convenient than try and go through a whole rigmarole. Additionally, our university archives only recently came under the purview of the library in the last 5 to 10 years. And so they developed their own tools for providing access to digital collections, as is shown in the bottom right. So with this proliferation of platforms, it can be incredibly difficult for users to find what they're looking for. So now I just popped up in the center of this slide a screenshot from our main library navigation. Under the center column, Unique Collections, users have to know which of these sites will bring them to the digital collection platform they need. Because in reality, some of the collections might be in Curate ND, our institutional repository, or at the university archives, or users might see the title Digital Exhibits and Collections and assume that's where all of our digital collections are, which is totally fair and logical, but inaccurate, unfortunately. So Melissa, Anna, and I are part of a new program in our library established in March 2020, dedicated to creating and implementing a unified approach to our user-facing online products. So in our new roles, we are invited to think holistically about our web presence, our assessment and user experience, and our strategy around digital collections and exhibits. As it turns out, this program and these new roles could not have come at a better time, as we are currently nearing the end of a 3-year grant to build a unified display exhibition platform for digital collections. This is another one for our library and campus art museum. So while that disparate platforms and that varied link language made it really difficult for users to find and browse our digital library holdings, this problem really came to a head when we decided we wanted to link from the library website to this new digital collection platform. So it's named Marble, and this platform features content from the Snite Museum of Art, which is our campus art museum, our rare books and special collections department, and our university archives. And moreover, it kind of makes the distinction between collections and exhibits a little more gray, because in Marble, users can create portfolios, a sort of middle ground where they can pull things together and annotate them, but not as advanced UI work as you would expect with an exhibit. But it quickly became clear that if we wanted to link to Marble from our library's main navigation, we would need to carefully consider the terms we use to describe not only this platform, but all of the other extant collections and tools. So we embarked on a research project to better understand not only what we call these projects, but how do we describe and present these tools out of context? So to say it another way, our problem statement was, how do we label links to our digital library tools in a way that makes it clear to users what they are getting based on a link? And with the recognition that various products have names that are immutable, how can we label links in a way that's more helpful than just the tool's name? To start this project, we did what every good librarian does, and we looked to see if our peer institutions had solved this problem for us. We recruited some student workers to help us conduct an environmental scan of the link language used by ARL libraries. We provided the students a list of libraries with links to the library website and asked them to capture terms in the main navigation that looked anything like digital collection, online exhibit, digital project. And as you can see from this word cloud, there was really no consensus around the terms used, because even though a phrase like digital collection appears pretty regularly, sometimes that might lead to an institutional repository, that more scholarly output. Sometimes it was more digital scholarship center or e-resources, and sometimes it was more digital collections, how I had thought of it. So while this provided some helpful language, we had to continue investigating what link language we might leverage. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Melissa.
Thank you. So we did a little bit of a literature scan as well, just to see what we could already find out there. A 2012 document by John Coopersmith called Library Terms That Users Understand highlights key findings from 51 usability studies that had been done up until that point about the importance of avoiding, and covers a wide range of library terms. So we know from this document, as well as other individual studies, about the importance of avoiding library jargon and using natural language when naming links. However, we also know that we can't use terms that are too general in the sort of natural language category, because then they don't provide enough contextual information for users. Additionally, we know from several studies, some included in that document, that brand names of library services are not always helpful to users. So as previously mentioned, we are currently calling our new digital collection site MARBLE, which is an acronym, but the name MARBLE on its own is not meaningful. So the challenge that we identified at the start of our user study is finding link terms for the MARBLE site and for our digital collections platform, as Michaela said, which internally and to a certain extent externally we call DEC, that meaningfully separate out what these two platforms do. One is primarily at this point for digital collections and the other is primarily for digital exhibits, though as Michaela mentioned, there is a little bit of gray area there. And we want to use words that are natural and meaningful to our general campus population, but are not so general so as to be vague. Burns et al. In 2019 reviewed terminology used by ARL libraries to identify which terms were most commonly used to label digitized cultural heritage collections. They identified a variety of terms used to describe these digital collections and designed a survey-based study to identify which terminology landed well with users and which terms caused confusion. The label options provided to respondents in their task-based questions included digital history collections, digital library, digital archives, and digital collections. While their results are really useful for our consideration, because they didn't test the phrase digital exhibit as one of their options, we still needed to know more. Additionally, there's no mention of best terms to use for digital collections or digital exhibits in that document that I mentioned earlier, library terms that users understand. So the three of us decided to conduct our own survey to see what we could find out. We're very aware that certain terms used in this situation that we've described have very specific meanings, especially for librarians, archivists, and curators. So in some circles, these terms might even be considered jargon, but it's important to accurately use these terms where appropriate. We need to take that into account when we decide on final terms for the links when we describe these two platforms. So now I'll talk a little bit about the surveys. We did two surveys, primarily, actually we only surveyed undergraduates and graduate students. In the first survey, we wanted to get student supplied terms for various types of digitized items. The challenge was we needed to keep the questions so vague on purpose because we didn't want to prime students by using certain terms in the questions themselves. So we sort of struggled with how much context is enough to help them understand what we're asking of them without priming them. And because we were specifically interested in how well students understand the use of terms like collections and exhibits, we also avoided using those in the survey. We referred to things on the survey as items and groupings. So screenshots from the MARBLE sites on the DEC platform were cropped to exclude words like collections, exhibits, or any other contextual information from the web page. And we asked students what terms would they use to title these groups of items. So our initial findings were interesting. Our purposefully vague questions led to some interesting responses, including some that were very specific, like 19th century art. Someone said like, almost all of these look like they're 19th century art. So that's what I would call this group of things. And some were so general that they just weren't helpful. Many students mentioned the words like artifact and historical in their responses. An artifact is interesting example because, as mentioned previously, words have meanings, and the word artifact has a pretty specific definition. However, undergraduate students may not necessarily be aware of that specificity, and when used generally is probably pretty well understood by others. So even if this were a term that were widely understood by the majority of students on our campus, we would maybe not use it as the only word in a link title for either of our platforms, because we know that that meaning has specific term, especially for curators and academics in specific disciplines. Historical is also interesting because many of the items on these platforms are in fact historical, but we can't assume that everything that will get digitized or included in the future will be historical. Also, historical is contextual relative to different people in the general population. Digitized items from the 2000s, which were actually included in our survey, may not seem historical to some of us, but to some of our students, this was. Similarly, the term primary sources, which did arrive in a few student answers, is tricky because primary and secondary sources can also be contextual. Whether something is a primary source or not depends on your research question and may not necessarily be an inherent characteristic of the source itself. So here's a word cloud for the terms that students chose to label items from what we would consider in our institution to be digital collections. Of course, we did not call them digital collections on the survey, as I mentioned, but you can see here that the major terms that came out were historical, art, which was interesting, and artifact. So we were very interested in that. And then for things that we would consider digital exhibits, so digitized items that have additional contextual information around them that sort of situate the item in a curated group of things. Students supplied terms, a whole bunch of stuff here. I would like to point out that the word animal shows up because the example that we used in the survey was a digitized exhibit of animal prints, and that's why that comes up. Also, the word call shows up because students wrote in things like, I'd call this, and then fill in the blank. But if we kind of look around, we see some just interesting general words there. I would also like to note that the words digital and collection were supplied for things that we would consider digital exhibits, further highlighting the complexity of this online environment. I'm going to let Anna talk to you about the second survey.
All right, thanks, Melissa. Yeah, so for our second survey, we took some of that really good data that we gathered from the first survey and went into testing specific terms. So we used kind of the terminology that we already use with digital collections and digital exhibits. From the student survey, we pulled that artifacts, which was very popular, and digital showcase was another option that showed up. And we also pulled a couple of terms from our ARL library scan that we weren't already using, so digital archive and digital projects. So what we did in our second survey, we had two sets of questions. The first set asked students about their content expectations when it came to seeing a link of any of these terms. And then the second set asked them to choose a link label for a particular item. So on this slide, you can see a sample of what those two questions look like. On the left is a single question from this first set, asking students about the type of content they would expect to see after clicking a particular link. So you'll notice in this list that we've included things that we do currently include in our digital collections and digital exhibits. Things like artwork, ephemera, metadata, that kind of stuff. But we've also included things that probably wouldn't show up in what we call digital collections or digital exhibits, like eBooks, data sets, scholarly journals. So we encourage students to select all the content items and features that they thought would show up if they clicked on one of these links. We provided the same set of content for each of the 6 terms that we were testing. So that was the first set of questions. The second set of questions, we have an example shown there on the right side. We showed students an object and its corresponding textual information from our collections or exhibits. We chose to actually copy and paste the text out of the platform into the survey. We didn't put all of the exhibit text because that would have been a lot, but we took a little bit of a sample. So this particular item here, Peru's first newspaper, is part of an exhibit. It's got the image of the item, and then it has some text that kind of describes the context of the times. For items in our collections, it was usually an image plus maybe a short introductory paragraph and a list of metadata. So for this set of questions, students were only able to select one choice, and we asked them to select the link that they thought they would follow to get to this particular item. So initial findings from this second survey, again, were that there was no consensus around what terms fit what context. We're still working on a full review, but our initial scan kind of shows that all of the link label questions had a mix of responses from students. There weren't really any clear patterns that we've been able to dig out so far. There were a few that maybe had a majority of people thought that this might be in an exhibit, but not consistently applied across the items that we looked at. So some of those kind of interesting or kind of curious trends that we did see, we did see that students tended to put art-like exhibits or art-like items in exhibits, both in the content questions and in the link label questions. We kind of wonder, is this because students are most familiar with exhibits in museums? So they're making that association. There were also broader expectations of what might be included in collections. So like eBooks and scholarly journals were more likely to show up there. And finally, a surprisingly few number of students expected to find metadata or related items in any of our link labels. So that was interesting. So on this next slide, you'll see a little bit of this kind of scattered response. That these are across the bottom are the different items that we showed students. And then the different colors are kind of what label they chose for that thing. So for example, you'll notice in the first bar that's labeled shoes, this is actually a print by Andy Warhol. It's held by the Snipe Museum of Art. And most students chose exhibits for that. And that's kind of one of the most consistent responses. But on our end, that item is actually housed in marble. So the context that you see around the image is like a short description, like the label that you would see in the museum and a list of metadata. So what are we gonna do with this information? Because those responses are all over the place, we're taking that to understand that our users don't understand the meaning of these specific terms in the way that we do as archivists, librarians, curators. And we know that even if we had found really strong preferences for our particular term, we'd still want to balance that with our professional knowledge. So in some, there's like no set of terms that we could use to label these links so that users are guaranteed to understand without context. So our next steps is that we are going to work on contextualizing the links. We're thinking of redesigning our library's navigation so that we can fit kind of more information around a link. To kind of provide that like passive education for our users of like, this is the term that we're using, this is what we mean, this is what you can expect to find. We are planning on future user testing to figure out if that's working for people and if it helps them get to these really cool collections and exhibits. And finally, we're kind of moving towards away, I guess, from the dichotomy of collections and exhibits. So knowing that our users don't really care whether it's a collection or exhibit, or perhaps don't understand what the difference between those things might be, thinking about on our end kind of all of these things as data, how do we help people get to the things that will help them wherever they are in the research process, whatever it is that they're looking for. So that's kind of what we've got. We are happy to take questions. We've got our emails here as well if you want to reach out to us afterwards.
Thank you all. Questions for Michaela, Melissa, and Anna? Feel free to use the Q&A section in Whova or just unmute yourself. Okay, a question from Sierra. Did you also discover during this process that internally the library didn't have a consensus on what was an exhibit versus what's a collection? Question.
I'll take this because this actually came up. We just recently shared kind of these preliminary results with colleagues as well. And yes, so I think that we as a library haven't really had the conversation about like, where is the delineation? And I think it's also complicated because we're pulling in other units that are part of, but like kind of separate. So Marble in particular brings together rare books, it brings together archives, and then it brings together the art museum, which is completely outside of the library. So yes, we did find that we are not totally in agreement, and that probably contextualization would help all of us to understand not just what do I click on to see something, but like, where do I go if I have a thing and I want to put it online? Should I send it to Marble to be added to a collection? Should I add it to our like digital exhibits and collections platform? So I think the context will definitely help us as well as our students.
Had you experimented any with the ideas around maybe imagery to help navigation? Like icons and other simple imagery. Although I know that those bring up their own set of accessibility problems, so.
I can answer this one. We have not talked about that in this particular instance yet as an option, but I will say that when we redesigned our library website, which is coming up on 4 years now, we did have a conversation then about sort of purposefully limiting our use of icons so as not to use them too often throughout the site and have people become inured to them, I guess. So it's not something that we've talked about recently. We could explore that here. You may have noticed that the Marble platform in the screenshot does have like a Marble icon of itself for that platform. That doesn't really say anything about what you'll find on it though. And I don't know, sometimes we do struggle with finding an icon that is like meaningfully understood by everybody. There are some that are universally applied, of course. But in this situation, I'm not sure off the top of my head which ones would be useful in that case, but it is worth us considering. Thanks for that question.
Any other questions for this team? Hearing none, I would like to thank Michaela, Melissa, and Anna, and Ian for your presentations today. And thank you all so much for joining us. I'm supposed to encourage you all to join us for upcoming TCDL sessions, but I don't think that there are anymore. So I'm going to encourage you all to bask in the glory that was 2021 TCDL. If you're curious, have a look at some of the sort of corresponding poster presentations that relate to this session. And I encourage you all to participate in the poster scavenger hunt, which is a super fun activity. I'm going to drop the link to that in the chat as well. And with that, I will bid you all adieu, and thank you all once again for joining us, and thanks to our presenters. Have a good day, everyone.